When we think about imagination, there are a couple particulars that we need to keep in mind. First, the fathers, particularly the Desert Fathers, are very concerned about the imagination. The imagination is source of all sorts of evil. And in speaking yesterday briefly with Father Alexis Trader about this, Father Alexis points these things out, and he also notes that the danger of imagination is the danger of distraction, particularly in prayer, because thoughts enter our mind, and do we push them out? Do we pursue them? Do we ponder them? Well, of course, we need to push them out. And the most disciplined of the monks, of course, are the ones who never have those thoughts. And so, in a sense, imagination needs to be trained, because when we're young, we can imagine all sorts of things that we never talk about except to our confessor. And we become involved and engrossed in these things. Evil imaginations, as the prayer says, that we ask God to free us from at night. And so these types of imaginations, the fathers are death upon. But at the same time, there must also be an imagination in which we think, how can I better love my wife? How can I better teach my students? What am I imagining for the school where I work? What is its future? How will it look? Because all of these parts of imagination are, in a sense, what is our vision for our life? How do we imagine it? How do we imagine a world that is given wholly to God? And of course, then imagination is, how do I communicate this? How do I communicate things to individuals? And we see the parables. And of course, we see, even in discussing theology, theology ultimately in many ways is the use of analogy to speak of God. And we have to come up with these analogies and fitting analogies. Now, analogies, we can push them too far to come up with all sorts of, heresy. And heresy means opinion. And so therefore, how is our imagination captive to the obedience of Christ? St. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians that we should bring every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And therefore, when we're thinking about imagination, how do I discipline my imagination so that it becomes a useful tool in service of God, in service of the true, the good, and the beautiful? Imagination also serves in many different ways. And it's the imagination then that we use as an act of, let us say, our oratory or our rhetoric, because it's imagination that allows us to compare this thing to that thing. So let us just think about the most highest forms of theology, our doctrines of Christ and the doctrines of the Incarnation, our doctrines of the Trinity. So it's in the doctrine of the Trinity that we first see, God has one nature, God is one. But God is also three persons. In the beginning of the Christological controversies, that finally, this language that we've used about the Trinity is, this should also be used here, that Christ is two natures in one person. And so this is actually an aspect of the imagination. And it's because reason would never tell us these things. Reason would never tell us these things. But the imagination brings us to the point where we realize, this is not only imagined, this is also rational because it is the truth. And I think that this is what it means for C.S. Lewis when Lewis makes the statement that imagination is the foundation of meaning, which then brings us to the truth. In other words, the facts then suddenly come into focus when we start using our imagination to understand them.